Okay, my name is Dolores Perez Heilbrunn, and I just wanted to talk to you about the First Unitarian Universalist Society of San Francisco acknowledges that we are located in the unceded ancestral homeland of the Ramaytush Ohlone peoples, who inhabited what is now the San Francisco Peninsula. The Greater Bay Area is also the ancestral territory of the Miwok, Yokuts, Patwin, and other Ohlone tribes. Indigenous communities have lived in and moved through this place, anthropologists say, for over 10,000 years. We further recognize that as the original stewards of this land, the Ohlone understood the interconnectedness of all beings and maintained harmony with nature for millennia. We honor them for their enduring commitment to our Mother Earth. As the indigenous stewards of this land, and in accordance with their traditions, these tribes have never ceded, lost, or forgotten their responsibilities as the caretakers of this place. As guests, we recognize that we benefit from living and working on their traditional homeland. We wish to pay our respects by acknowledging these indigenous occupants and by affirming their sovereign rights as First Peoples. Please join us in a moment of silence to acknowledge and honor their ancestors. Today, we are very honored to welcome a brother whose research we honor, Professor Benjamin Madley, the author of An American Genocide, the United States and the California Indian Catastrophe, 1846 to 1873. This will help enlighten us about the history of this state and the rest of this country, which was kept from us for too long. Professor Madley will speak for about 40 minutes. We will then have a Q&A session. You may type in questions in the chat tab and try to make them as brief as possible because we have so many people that would like to speak to him. Thank you so much and welcome, Professor Madley.
Thank you very much, Dolores. First of all, I thank all of you for coming out on a Sunday to hear about what I'm afraid is going to be a very difficult and grim topic. Just so that you know, this is a graphic, sad, and deeply disturbing presentation. I'd also like to make a few prefatory remarks before we begin. I'd like to thank Jim Barnett and also Dolores Heilbrunn for their hard work in putting this together and for meeting with me via Zoom and via emails to set this all up. I would also like to acknowledge that I am also on indigenous land. I am on Tongva Gabrielino land, also like the land on which many of you live. This is the unceded and ancestral territory of indigenous people who have lived here for many, many thousands of years, and according to them, since time immemorial. If there's one thing that you take away from our time together this afternoon, I hope that you'll think about this idea that we're all on indigenous land, always, wherever we go in these United States. In fact, wherever you go from the shores of the Arctic to the tip of Patagonia, you will be on someone's ancient and ancestral homelands. I'm going to screen share now because I'd like to illustrate my talk with a variety of images. The ceremony continued until just before dawn. Illuminated by a central fire, the celebrants moved together in ancient rhythm, the women's clamshell necklaces clinking quietly against their seashell dresses. Male dancers, dressed in the regalia of deer, birds, and hunters, supported the females in their heavy regalia. Meanwhile, the singers raised their voices skyward, with the songs of knee dash or the feather dance, giving thanks for the creation of the world and its renewal in each and every moment. Finally, the celebrants stopped and walked away under a full moon. Nearby, they passed through small, round doorways to snug redwood houses, where they lay down next to kith and kin. The celebrants were unaware that less than 7 miles away, Crescent City men had established their own branch of California's expanding killing machine. Crescent City's Coast Rangers and Klamath Mounted Rangers had been well armed by California Governor John Bigler. He had provided them with 20 muskets, 95 rifles, swords, sabers, and thousands of rounds of ammunition. They now prepared to do one thing and one thing only: kill Indian people. In the pre-dawn hours of the last day of 1854, as many as 116 California state militiamen and an unknown number of auxiliaries quietly surrounded the village and took up hidden positions. At daybreak, as women, men, and children emerged to begin the day, the militiamen and vigilante auxiliaries opened fire on them. "They shot them down," said one participant, "just as fast as we could reload our rifles." Possessing only 3 guns, the California Indian people there that morning were not able to defend themselves. A few plunged into nearby Lake Earl, but there too they became targets. Those who swam across the lake encountered the fire of a second group of sharpshooters positioned in wait on the far shore. When the shooting stopped, perhaps hundreds of people were dead. Not more than 5 seemed to have survived the onslaught. The attackers apparently suffered a single casualty, and the state of California later paid the militiamen for their. Between the years 1846 and 1873, California's indigenous population plunged perhaps 150,000 individuals to just 30,000. Diseases, dislocation, and starvation caused many of these deaths. However, abduction, unfree labor, and mass death on reservations, homicides, battles, and hundreds of documented massacres also took many lives and hindered biological reproduction. This was a case of genocide. So this gives you a sense of the dramatic population decline of California Indian people between the time that the United States invaded California in 1846 and about the year 1880. In 1948, the United Nations Genocide Convention defined genocide, as you see here, as acts committed with intent to destroy, in whole or in part, a national, ethnical, racial, or religious group as such. Now, for an international prosecutor to successfully convict a defendant of the crime of genocide, they must prove 2 things. First, they must prove that the defendant had, beyond any reasonable shadow of a doubt, genocidal intent, that is, the intent to destroy. And secondly, they must also prove that the defendant committed at least one of the 5 genocidal crimes that you see defined here. Now, following the formulation of this new international legal treaty, scholars began to re-examine the colonization of California by the United States. And by the turn of the present century, more than 20 scholars had deemed the events in California during these years to be a case of genocide. So why would I spend more than a decade writing a book about this topic? Well, because the stakes are so high and because until now, we have really not known the complete story. This topic calls for meticulous attention to detail because the stakes are high, not only for scholars like myself, but for California Indian people and for everyone making a life in the United States. If US citizens founded some regions of California, if not the state as a whole, on deliberate attempts to physically annihilate California Indian people, scholars will need to reevaluate some of the basic interpretive axioms that we use to understand the making of California. We could, for example, re-examine the dominant assumption that it was the indirect effects of colonization like epidemic old world diseases, rather than deliberate actions like mass murder, that were the leading cause of death and demographic decline among California Indian nations. Exceptionalist interpretations of United States history also lose validity as researchers begin to compare the genocidal events that transpired in California with other, more widely known genocides around the globe. A careful study of what happened in California can also assist scholars in re-examining the much larger hemispheric indigenous population catastrophe. Where scholars document a genocide, it will be necessary to evaluate what roles governments and private individuals played, as well as whether or not that event was part of a recurring regional, national, or perhaps even hemispheric pattern. Larger questions follow. What tended to catalyze genocide? Who ordered the killing? Who bloodied their hands carrying it out? Why do we not know more about these events? Did democracy drive mass murder? And ultimately, what role did genocide play in the making of modern Canada, Mexico, the United States, and the other nations of the Western Hemisphere? The genocide question is particularly urgent for California's approximately 150,000 individuals of California Indian ancestry. As I made many visits over the years to California Indian communities, it came to be clear that there were major questions here. Should tribal leaders press for apologies, monetary reparations, and control of the lands where genocidal events took place? Will tribes be able to marshal evidence of genocide in cases involving tribal sovereignty and federal recognition? How should they commemorate the victims of mass murder while also emphasizing successful accommodation, resistance, survival, and cultural renaissance? The psychological issues I learned are also fraught. How does a tribal member deal with learning that she is both the descendant of a genocide perpetrator and a genocide survivor? How will California Indian communities reconcile increased knowledge of genocide, sometimes at the hands of the United States, with their often intense patriotism and high levels of volunteering for the United States Armed Forces? Finally, what role might acknowledgement of genocide have on the intergenerational historical trauma so prevalent in many California Indian communities today, and that trauma's connection to present-day physical illnesses, substance abuse, domestic violence, and the highest rates of youth suicide in the state of California? The question of genocide in California, though, is not just a question for scholars and California Indian people. It also poses explosive questions for everyone who lives in the United States. Should government officials tender public apologies, as did Presidents Ronald Reagan and George Herbert Walker Bush in the 1980s, for the forcible relocation and internment of some 120,000 Japanese Americans, many of them California citizens, during the Second World War? Should federal officials offer monetary compensation along the lines of the more than $1.6 billion that Congress has now paid out to some 82,000 Japanese Americans and their heirs? Might California state officials decrease their cut of California Indians' $7.3 billion a year in annual gaming revenue as a way of paying monetary reparations? A better understanding of California genocide might also impact the federal government's relations with California Indian people, particularly those seeking federal recognition. And the question of commemoration is also closely linked. Will non-Indians support or even tolerate the same kinds of public commemoration of mass murders committed by the state's forefathers with the same kinds of public monuments, museums, and state legislated days of remembrance that today commemorate the Armenian genocide and the Holocaust? Will genocides against California Indian people join these mass murders in our public school curricula or in our public discourse? These questions are all extremely important, but they can be addressed only in very limited ways without a more comprehensive understanding of exactly what happened here in California between 1846 and 1873. Sporadic mass killings of California Indian people punctuated the initial years of US rule in California. But James Marshall's 1848 gold strike precipitated a local genocide. Oregon men, like this man, played a leading role in increasing violence against California Indians. They rarely had connections to California's Hispanic economy and society, in which indigenous people played integral roles. And many of the newcomers from Oregon saw California Indians as little more than dangerous obstacles to wealth. Now, one thing that you can see if you look closely at this famous painting by Charles Knoll is just how heavily armed many of these gold miners were. You can see that in this man's right hand, he is holding a .50 caliber rifle. At his hip, he is carrying what appears to be a Colt naval 6-shooter revolver. And in his boot, we can see a Bowie knife. What we can't see are the other weapons that he may have on his left side. But what we do know is that most miners came to California heavily armed, carrying at least one, if not many, weapons. In 1849, Oregonian attacks on California Indians increased in both frequency and lethality, particularly in the central mines, which were booming. And if you look at this map here, you can see the central mines marked. As one 49er explained, and I quote, "Oregon people have been used to shooting Indians, and they did shoot them freely." That April, Theodore Johnson entered the epicenter of this local genocide, Coloma, at Sutter's Mill, where Marshall had found gold. In the central mines, Johnson and others recounted multiple massacres, scalpings, beheadings, and the slaying of surrendered California Indian civilians. Due to spotty primary source coverages, there were no newspapers in the mines at this point in time. We will never know the precise number of California Indian people who died violent deaths in 1849 and early 1850, but hundreds, if not thousands, did die. What was clear to observers was the exterminatory nature of such killings, both in their impact and in their intent. In December of 1849, Wapo and Pomo people, held as unfree laborers, rose up and killed their white captors near what is now Kelseyville on the shores of Clear Lake in Lake County. In response to this double homicide, vigilantes and regular United States Army troopers killed as many as 1,000 California Indian people or more between December 1849 and May 1850. Vigilantes first murdered and massacred large numbers in what is now Napa and Sonoma valleys. Then, after authorities arrested some of the perpetrators, California's Supreme Court, in its very first case, let them all go on bail. Meanwhile, the United States Army also sought to avenge the deaths of these two white ranchers. In a San Francisco newspaper article titled "Horrible Slaughter of Indians," one journalist described a massacre committed by the US Army on Clear Lake, using information provided directly by a serving US Army captain. And I quote, "Little or no resistance was encountered, and the work of butchery was of but short duration. Neither sex nor age were spared. It was the order of extermination fearfully obeyed," end quote. As many as 800 California Indian people, mainly women and children, were beaten to death, shot dead, or drowned that day. Other killings followed, and the officers involved were not censured. Rather, they received promotions. One of them later became governor of the state of California. Two of them became full US Army generals. A new factor was at work: large-scale, extended vigilante and United States Army killing campaigns tolerated and rewarded by both state and federal officials. As the gold rush continued, immigrants surged into California. Before the gold rush, there were perhaps 13 or 14,000 non-Indians in California. But by 1860, census takers counted over 360,000 of them. They came primarily in search of wealth, but in seeking to access gold, eat, dress, acquire labor, and satisfy their sexual desires, immigrants placed immense pressures on California Indian people. These demands triggered an explosion in large-scale ranching, hunting, gold mining, and slave raiding. These activities generated shockwaves that had devastating impact on California Indian individuals, villages, and nations. California's new leaders magnified that impact. Under martial law, the US military officers in charge of governing California made California Indian people into second-class citizens with few rights. California's 1849 Constitution, written here in this building, then made it nearly impossible for any Indian person to vote. And in 1850, California's first legislature banned all Indians from voting, barred Indians with 1/2 of Indian blood or more from providing evidence for or against whites in criminal cases, and banned all Indians from serving as jurors. They later barred Indians from serving as attorneys in the state of California. In combination, these laws largely shut Indian people out of participation in and protection by the new state's legal system. Abduction played a major role in the California Indian population decline. In 1850, legislators passed an Act for the Government and Protection of Indians, which legalized white custody of Indian minors and Indian prisoner leasing, while allowing courts and juries to summarily reject Indian testimony. Indian people could thus be forced into unpaid work on trumped-up charges. We're looking here at an advertisement that I found in the archives at the Bancroft Library, just across the bay from you, which is advertising in French, interestingly enough, a 16-year-old Southern California Indian female at the price of a pound of gunpowder and a bottle of brandy. 10 years later, in 1860, legislators extended the 1850 Act to legalize the indenture of any Indian. These laws triggered a boom in violent kidnappings while separating women and men during peak reproductive years, both of which accelerated California Indian population decline. And some people were treated as disposable laborers. As one lawyer recollected, and I quote, "Los Angeles had its weekly Monday morning slave mart, and thousands of Indian people were absolutely destroyed in this way." Indeed, between the year 1850 and 1870, Los Angeles's Indian population plummeted from 3,693 to just 219. Escape was one way that California Indian people defied servitude, but whites sometimes responded with lethal force. The Lasik and Wailaki Indian woman, Lucy Young, who we see in portrait here toward the end of her life, she escaped servitude multiple times, and she recollected, and I quote, "Young woman been stole by white people, come back, shot through lights and liver, front skin hang down like apron, she tie up with cotton dress, never die neither," end quote. Others were less fortunate. After one California Indian woman fled her, quote, "lord and master with his Indian boy," end quote, in 1858, whites massacred some 15 people, her entire village. 2 years later, a rancher became so incensed when his 7-year-old California Indian servant visited his family 1/2 mile away that he, quote, "slaughtered the whole family of about 6 persons, boy and all." Despite such reports, which were common in the newspapers of the day, policymakers generally failed to intervene, while almost all law enforcement officials turned a blind eye. The United States Congress, meanwhile, made California Indians particularly vulnerable to immigration's blast. In 1851 and 1852, 3 federal agents signed 18 treaties with 119 California Indian tribes, allocating them 7,488,000 acres. Those are the gray areas that you see on this map surrounded by white areas. However, when the treaties reached Washington, D.C., United States senators repudiated all of the treaties. Instead, in 1853, Congress authorized 5 military reservations not to exceed 25,000 acres each and conferred no recognition or legal land titles. The results were fourfold. First, reservations were not patented and jurisdiction over them remained uncertain. Second, because jurisdiction remained uncertain, confusion and conflict between and among state and federal authorities prevailed. Third, California Indians did not become the explicit wards of the federal government. Finally, U.S. Army Major General John Wool's 1857 interpretation of California reservations' legal status denied them the federal Army's protection. And I quote, "Until these reservations are perfected, the United States troops have no right to exclude the whites from entering or occupying the reserves, or even to prevent them from taking from the reserves women and children," end quote. Federal officials thus made California Indian people particularly vulnerable to slavery, assault, and murder. The establishment of California's militia system now marked the rise of a state-sponsored killing machine. Between the years 1850 and 1861, 3,414 California militiamen enrolled in 24 state-sponsored expeditions, killing a minimum of 1,342 California Indian people. However, their impact transcended these particular killings. Militiamen served as a widely publicized state endorsement of Indian killing, communicating an unofficial grant of legal impunity for Indian killing and inspiring many more vigilante murders. Indeed, vigilantes killed over 6,400 California Indian people between 1846 and 1873. Only very rarely were they prosecuted or punished for such crimes. In January of 1851, California Governor Peter Burnett declared, and I quote, "that a war of extermination will continue to be waged until the Indian race becomes extinct." The following month, California state legislators voted to borrow $500,000, a huge sum of money, for past and future anti-Indian state militia expeditions. Meanwhile, the state began building an arsenal of arms in San Francisco, donated to them by the United States Army. Then, in 1852, United States Senator John Weller, who later became California's governor in 1858, told his fellow United States senators in Washington, D.C. that California Indians, and I quote, "will be exterminated." Weller insisted, and I quote, "the interest of the white man demands their extermination." That same year, state legislators passed a new $600,000 bond measure to support additional militia operations, even as vigilante killings continued. We're seeing here one of these actual bond certificates. The coupons that would have been attached to the bottom of it to be turned in and redeemed for payment of interest have all been sliced off. But there are many of these bond certificates. Probably if you want to see some of them, the closest ones are over in the Bancroft Library across the bay. And one of the interesting things about these bonds is that they came in a variety of denominations, some as small as $50, meant for individual private investors, and some as large as $500, probably meant for institutional investors. The Sinkyone woman Sally Bell provides us with a rare California Indian eyewitness account of a massacre that took place in her Redwood homeland sometime during the 1850s. Bell remembered, and I quote, About 10 o'clock in the morning, some white men came. They killed my grandfather and my mother and my father. I saw them do it. Then they killed my baby sister and cut her heart out and threw it into the brush where I ran and hid. My little sister was a baby, just crawling around. I didn't know what to do. I was so scared that I guess I just hid there a long time with my little sister's heart in my hands. It was a terrifying time to be a California Indian. The United States endorsed such killings even as state and federal leaders perfected the killing machine. In 1854, Congress allocated over $924,000 to reimburse the state of California for its past militia campaigns. The following year, State Quartermaster and Adjutant General William C. Kibi, who we see here, he was the man who ran California's militia system from 1852 through 1863, underscored the California state militia's genocidal purpose. And I quote from one of his annual reports, "There are but two alternatives before us, viz., either to wage a war of extermination or abandon a large and productive territory," end quote. To help perfect his killing machine, Kibi had published a tactical manual and distributed it to his militia officers. Meanwhile, then Secretary of War Jefferson C. Davis sent Kibi U.S. Army tactical manuals to distribute to his militiamen as Christmas presents. Then in 1857, state legislators appropriated an additional $410,000 for militia operations with predictable results. Finally, in 1861, even as civil war was beginning to rend the nation apart, Congress appropriated another $400,000 to help California pay for its militia expeditions. Civilians and officials also carried out large-scale forced removal operations during this time to concentrate surviving California Indians on federal reservations. For example, in 1856, vigilantes massacred 55 California Indian people while forcing one group to the Mendocino Reservation. The Lake Yakuts woman Yoy Mut recollected that during the forced removal of her people to the Fresno Reservation, soldiers first killed 12 Indians and then another 12 during the forced march. Likewise, the known Lackey man Andrew Freeman explained that, and I quote, "When they took the Indians to the Round Valley Reservation, they drove them like stock and they shot the old people who couldn't make the trip. They would shoot children who were getting tired." Once at a reservation, California Indians often encountered institutionalized malnutrition and lethal starvation. The Concow leader Tomayanem recollected that after volunteers had forcibly removed his people to the Mendocino Reservation, quote, "We were very hungry and the Concows began to die very fast." Other reservations proved little better. In about 1860, Tomayanem and his people relocated to Round Valley Reservation, where he recollected, and I quote, "There was even less to eat," end quote. Indeed, in 1860, officials typically provided 480 to 910 calories per day to working Round Valley Reservation Indians. 2 years later, in 1862, daily rations there fell to 160 to 390 calories per person per day. Further diminishing these already inadequate rations, those who did not work were infrequently fed, if at all. Now, if some California Indian reservation inmates died of institutionalized starvation, malnutrition weakened the immune systems of others, making them more susceptible to lethal diseases. Starvation and malnutrition also predictably depressed fecundity while increasing miscarriages and stillbirths. Some reservation officials and colonists also used Indians on reservations as unpaid laborers with lethal results. According to one colonist testifying under oath, about 300 died on the Round Valley Reservation during the winter of 1856 to 1857 from the effects of packing them through the mountains in snow and mud. They were generally worked naked and packed 50 pounds each, if able." End quote. At California reservations, willful neglect took an untold number of lives. Federal employees also killed large numbers of California Indian people more directly. During the United States Civil War, 15,725 California men enlisted in the Union Army. Thousands of them remained in California and soon transformed the killing machine. As US troops, these so-called California volunteers replaced relatively small, short-term state militia campaigns with much larger and much longer duration operations. The Army now fielded the most sustained military operations ever seen in the state of California. Vigilante operations flourished alongside these campaigns, but the genocide was now a federal project. And US Army forces killed substantial numbers. The first California Volunteer Army campaign in 1862 killed at least 120 California Indian people. Hundreds more would die in succeeding operations directed by men like Colonel Henry M. Black, pictured here. California volunteers also killed prisoners en masse on multiple occasions. US Cavalry Captain Moses M. McLaughlin proudly reported how in 1863, "I had all the bucks collected together and 35 were either shot or sabred. None escaped." McLaughlin proudly concluded, "They will soon either be killed off or pushed so far in the surrounding deserts that they will perish by famine." The US Army continued killing California Indian people through the late 1860s. Even after officers concluded their last large-scale killing operation, the 1872 to 1873 Modoc War, they hanged and beheaded 4 surrendered Modoc prisoners before shipping their severed heads to Washington, D.C. The California Indian Catastrophe fits the 2-part definition set forth in the UN Genocide Convention. First, perpetrators demonstrated in both word and in deed their intent to destroy, in whole or in part, a national, ethnical, racial, or religious group as such. Second, they committed all 5 genocidal crimes listed in the convention. Killing members of the group occurred in more than 370 separate massacres, as well as hundreds of homicides and executions. Sources indicate that between the years 1846 and 1873, vigilantes, militiamen, and regular United States Army soldiers killed at least 9,462 to 16,094 California Indians, and probably many, many more. By way of contrast, California Indian people killed fewer than 1,500 non-Indians during this entire time period. And other acts of genocide proliferated too. Many rapes and beatings occurred, and these meet the convention's definition of causing serious bodily harm to victims on the basis of their group identity and with the intent to destroy the group. The sustained military and civilian policy of demolishing California Indian villages and their food supplies while driving survivors into inhospitable desert and alpine regions amounted to deliberately inflicting on the group conditions of life calculated to bring about its physical destruction in whole or in part. Some United States Office of Indian Affairs employees administering federal Indian reservations in California committed the same genocidal crime. Further, because malnutrition and exposure predictably lowered fertility while increasing the number of miscarriages and stillbirths, some state and federal decision makers also appear guilty of imposing measures intended to prevent births within the group. Finally, the state, slave raiders, and federal officials were all involved in forcibly transferring children of the group to another group. 3,000 to 4,000 or more California Indian children suffered such forced transfers. By breaking up families and shattering whole communities, forced removals also constituted imposing measures intended to prevent births within the group. Sufficient evidence exists to designate the California Indian Catastrophe a case of genocide, according to the UN Convention definition. Elected California leaders were the primary architects of annihilation. Legislators created a legal environment in which California Indians had almost no rights, thus granting those who attacked them virtual impunity. Moreover, 2 governors threatened annihilation, and both governors and elected officials cooperated in building a complex killing machine. California governors called out or authorized no fewer than 24 state militia expeditions between 1850 and 1861, which killed a minimum of 1,342 California Indian people. State legislators also raised up to $1.51 million to fund these operations. This was a truly huge amount of money at the time, and during this years, it was always the largest line item in California's state debt. By demonstrating that the state would not punish Indian killers, but rather would reward them, state militia expeditions inspired an even greater number of vigilante killings. Finally, in 1863, after the United States Army supplanted the state as driving the killing machine, California legislators passed yet another bill allowing the state to raise an additional $600,000 to encourage California men to enlist in the Army as California volunteers. Yet it is important to understand that the state of California did not act alone. The United States Army played an absolutely crucial role in the California genocide, first creating the state's exclusionary legal system, then setting genocidal precedents, helping to build the killing machine, participating in killing, and finally taking control of it. In total, U.S. Army soldiers killed at least 1,688 to 3,741 California Indians between 1846 and 1873. If state legislators were the architects of this genocide, federal officials helped to lay the groundwork, became the final arbiters of its design, and ultimately paid for most of its official execution. By 1863, the federal government had given the state of California more than $1 million for its militia campaigns. Of course, by 1863, the United States Army had taken over as the primary state-sponsored killer, and Congress controlled that institution's budget. Indeed, federal legislators paid for some or all of many lethal campaigns against California Indians that began in 1846 and concluded in 1873. Like California Indians, Native American people across what is now the United States suffered a devastating population decline following the arrival of newcomers. Before contact, perhaps 5 million or more indigenous people inhabited what is now the continental United States. By 1900, census takers counted fewer than 250,000 survivors. What caused this catastrophe? Diseases, colonialism, and war all played important roles, but was something more sinister to blame? There is work on the question of genocide in United States history, but much more remains to be done. The direct and deliberate killing of California Indian people between 1846 and 1873 was more lethal and more sustained than anywhere else in the United States or its colonial antecedents. Yet there remains a need for additional detailed case studies addressing other regions and peoples within and beyond the United States. The variables present in the California genocide did not recur in precisely the same combination or at the same intensities in the histories of all other Native peoples. In other cases, disease was the overwhelming cause of mortalities. Both state and federal, or colonial and metropolitan decision makers were not complicit in every case. Other Native American peoples employed different survival and resistance strategies, for example, fleeing contact zones or killing larger numbers of colonizers than California Indian people did. Finally, in other cases, colonizers may have committed fewer or no genocidal crimes, while the causes and rates of death differed. We need to build on our existing knowledge with new research in order to better understand the full picture for the United States, North America, and the entire Western Hemisphere. This book, I hope, presents a model of how such research can be done within and beyond the Americas. The UN Genocide Convention provides us with a standardized, internationally recognized rubric and a coherent legal definition that can be consistently applied. Scholars should rigorously consider every potential case in such terms. Just as important, we need to think of American Indian peoples as nations and not as one integral whole. Thus, each nation deserves its own discrete study. Native American peoples experienced and reacted to invasion and colonization in a wide variety of ways. Rigorously examining this range of cases using the Genocide Convention to evaluate both genocidal intent and genocidal acts may help to move the discussion of the question of genocide in the Western Hemisphere toward clarity. Unbraiding each region's particular story from the tapestry of Native American history and bringing each into sharper relief will create a clearer, more vivid portrait of Native American experiences and of Western Hemisphere history as a whole. Such investigations will be painful, but they will help all Americans, both native and non-native, to make more accurate sense of our past and ourselves. Thank you.